Hi guys. So we're going to talk about the Rapoport and Rapoport case study. It is the first case study that we actually covered at the very start of year 10. It's not a difficult one, okay, but it sort of disguises itself as quite a complex idea, but it's really not. So it should be quite simple for you. So it really does focus around this idea of family diversity just here. Okay. Again, that's a term that really shouldn't scare you. Okay. Family diversity, literally referring to the fact that modern society, at least, has lots of different types of family. Okay. Very simple stuff. So the Rappaports were conducting their study very much in sort of response to functionalist ideas of the nuclear family being sort of the one ideal type of family. Okay, and they identified these five strands of family diversity to show that it's not as simple as that. There are lots of different types of families, and there are lots of reasons behind that diversity. Okay, so let's just jump right in. The first one is organizational diversity. Okay, again, long words and whatnot shouldn't scare you. This is painfully simple, this first one. Okay, it is literally referring to the fact that families organize themselves in different ways. Okay, referring to sort of lots of different aspects of society that can affect it. So, for example, the rise in divorce and the decrease in marriage means that there's a lot more single parent families. Okay, so a single parent family would organize itself in a very different way to how the nuclear family would have organized itself. Okay, furthermore, there are different patterns of work. Okay, because previously, as you hopefully know, the nuclear family would be that the father would go out and work, okay, and earn the money to sort of sustain the family, whereas the mum would stay at home. Okay, but that doesn't really work in modern society anymore. And both parents generally have to go out and work. Okay, and that basically leads to lots of different ways of handling all the different jobs associated with living in a household. Okay, so maybe mum does one thing and dad does another, whilst both working to different schedules. Okay, so organizational diversity is very much just referring to the fact that within each family type, there's lots of different ways that they organize themselves. Okay, so moving on to cultural diversity. Now, I would argue that this one is actually probably one of the better ones to explain if it comes up in an exam, because usually the way they sort of word it in an exam is identify one form of family diversity identified by the Rappaports. Okay, that could be one way that they could phrase it. And as I say, you'd only need one for that. Okay, that doesn't mean to say you can't learn all five, but one could be all that you need. And if it were one, I would go for this one. Okay, so what it's referring to is the fact that if depending on your culture, you could have a different family because of that. Okay, so for example, families who've migrated to the UK from different parts of the world will bring with them different traditions and beliefs about how the family should be set up. Okay, sort of an extreme example could be the fact that different parts of the world practice different types of relationships. So in Britain, we're very sort of right and proper in how we see things. So we're very monogamous. Okay, we're only with one person at any one time. Hence the sort of the nuclear family, mother and father. Okay, whereas in other parts of the world, it might be seen as more acceptable to engage in polygamy and maybe even polyandry relationships. So being with multiple people rather than just one. Okay, so that's definitely a source of diversity. Equally, religious beliefs can't be ignored. Okay, it really can affect the way that families are shaped. So, for example, some religions, i.e., Catholicism could be one of them, amongst many others, have really strict rules around contraception. So that could lead to families with larger numbers of children. Okay, naturally, because if they can't use contraception, then more children are going to be born. Okay, so that's another form of diversity. Another difference is the fact that some families, depending on culture, might be patriarchal, whereas some could be matriarchal. Okay, and what I mean by that is female headed rather than male dominated. Okay, so again, that is very much a cultural thing, and it can be affected by where you come from, what ethnicity you align with, and just a whole bunch of things that sort of is summed up in culture. Okay, beliefs and values. Okay, so that's quite a good one. There's a lot of examples that you can give, even more than I've given you here. Okay, so be quite creative with that, but make sure you're linking it back to family diversity. So, social class diversity. I would argue that this is one of the more difficult ones, okay? But basically, they argue that within lower class families, there is greater instability, okay? Whether that be from employment or just general sort of value systems, they argue that it's less stable than upper and middle class families, okay, where they might employ a more traditional approach. They might be more likely to have those sort of conventional family types, if you like. They might have a more conventional attitude towards education, for example. They might be more encouraging of their children sort of succeeding and place emphasis on educational activities, whereas a working class or a lower class family might not. Okay, so they might be moving around a lot. They might be sort of changing the setup of the family quite a lot depending on working habits. If they're working, okay, there could be unemployment in there as well. So there's a lot of different things to do with social class. But as I say, it's quite a difficult one because there's so many examples you could give without wishing to try and maybe offend anyone. It's quite a difficult one to sort of to balance around. So know what that one means for sure, but perhaps avoid it if you are asked to identify just one. Okay, the cultural and even the organizational diversity is the way to go with that one. Okay, now on to life cycle diversity. This is a good one. Okay, quite simple, quite easy to understand. Perhaps not the best name, okay, but it'll make more sense once I've explained it. So this is the diversity that can happen depending on when you're living. Okay, so for example, if you were living in the 1950s or the late 1940s, then there were a lot more single parent families because sadly, the husbands in the families had been killed whilst out at war. So naturally, the period that you're living in has had a huge effect on what type of families there are around. Okay, equally in the 1920s, there was the Great Depression, sort of the economic instability of the time. Okay, and the fertility rate went down. So naturally, that meant that there were less children. Okay, so more sort of single parent, sort of non-parent families, I should say, what we'd probably call empty nest or just sort of cohabiting families. Or childless families, and they basically just didn't have children around as much. So basically, attitudes change, okay, depending on what historical period you are in. So, for example, in these days, we have a very sort of lax attitude around divorce. We don't see the importance in marriage so much anymore. And cohabitation is on the rise, so people living together without actually getting married. And the Rapoports argue that basically this is one of the main contributors to family diversity in general. Okay. And then finally, we have family life course diversity. Okay, the final one. So the idea being that depending on where you are in your life, okay, you will be going through a different set of priorities and different set of values, and that will affect how your family is organized. Okay, so for example, having a baby, okay, would change the domestic duties of both of the parents. Okay, it's probably a huge change for them, and they will have to sort of change their sort of family makeup to try and suit the baby, as it were. Okay, equally, children leaving for university or sort of simply moving out of the house would change the dynamic in a household and ultimately change their domestic duties drastically. Okay, they'd have one less person to think about, and yeah, it would change hugely. Okay, one thing to note about the Rapoports, okay, their work was in the 1980s, so it predates sort of gay and lesbian households, okay, same-sex families and whatnot. That's something that needs to be incorporated, but in essence, that's the 5 forms of family diversity. Okay, so that should hopefully cover everything. Don't